Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
These gobblers have these just, conspicuous displays, behaviorally, also all the feathers, the snood, the beard, spurs, and all these things. And, we know from Rich Buchholz's work, the snood seems to be important, and it may convey defense against parasites, or the gobblers with the longer snood or have fewer parasites, and makes sense that females that mate with those males or hens are going to get maybe some kind of genetic protection from the whatever diseases are out there. So it's one of these one explanation for how you get these strongly dimorphic, males much bigger, showier than the females. And the females, they have these other pressures to look conspicuous and hide their nests and evade predators. But one of the things that you think about sexual selection, which is what maybe is driving some of these traits, what we see now is has built up over many, many generations of turkeys. And so you can have traits that maybe in the past were they conveyed some benefit, and then once all the males get that trait, then it's no longer informative, and that kind of process can build up over time. And there's a process called chase-away selection, which it's hard to demonstrate, with experiments, because you need to watch things play out over, so many different generations and over time. But one of the predictions is you may get these males that have all these things that females maybe don't even care about, or it needs to appear there, but they don't. Hens aren't going to care, maybe exactly how long the beard is or how big the tail is or things like that. So when we're seeing kind of a turkey that's been built up over, thousands of years, millions of years, maybe, and we're seeing the history of that choice in the past, but maybe hens don't care about that, the details of that day to day. Like, it could be, maybe it's you need to have these things, but it doesn't matter exactly how, neat your tail looks or how shiny your feathers are, things like that. So that's one hypothesis for how we get, what's just, spectacular looking bird. But you go to look at what hens are choosing, and maybe it is only a few things that are going to carry variation that matters to the female, and that not all males are going to be able to produce the best example of that trait.
Yeah, Alan, I was going to ask you, I just got a question maybe 2 or 3 days ago about what is the function of a beard on a turkey. So maybe that's one of those sort of relic traits like you're talking about, that maybe it doesn't have a really strong function. I mean, I think even in some of that previous work you mentioned, they cut the beard off, I think, and it still didn't matter to the females, right?
I think that's true. I mean, that's one that it conveys some information, maybe up to 2 or 3 year old gobblers, but at some point it's just going to wear off. And I definitely had one of my top breeding gobblers had a broken beard. So
oh, really?
Oh, that's interesting.
And his brother had a full beard, so it that's an anecdote of one. But
The
And
one with the
yeah,
broken beard secured most of the breeding opportunity.
mhm, right, yeah.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
it's yeah, I would imagine that's a great example of this kind of crazy trait that uh, yeah, they have it, and if if you had a, it might be hard for a gobbler to rise up through the ranks without one, maybe, but it
Hmm.
probably the
But if
hens
he
are probably
does,
full
he's
of other stuff.
tough.
So I mean, they're pretty fascinating. I've actually almost you know started a project on them. Just it's a really unusual trait in that it's basically feather material, but it's not molted, and so you could actually take beards, and maybe somebody's done this by now, but kind of chop them up, and you'd get maybe 2-3 year um, sample of uh, work for stable isotopes, which is something that you can
Mm,
use to look at kind of general categories of diet. So are they eating out of agricultural fields or not? You might get a signature from that, or how much protein are they getting from insects in different places and things like that. So I think it could be a really useful tool for managers
Hmm.
to understand diet, which that can be a hard thing to get like a full year's worth um, of information on when your harvest is only at certain times a year.
Right.
And otherwise, you need pellets or um, observational um, uh, studies,
Hmm.
which take a lot of time and
Yeah.
may have their own biases. But you have this trait that would have this some record of what they're eating at different times a year, which I think is pretty interesting. Yeah, I don't know that we know much about the beard, so I think it's a cool trait to look at in the future.
Yeah.
absolutely.
You've got my head spinning about that. I was just thinking, man, could we get like 10,000 people to send us a strand from their turkey beards? But then I started thinking about how many beards do we have laying around? They're like 100 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that would be another way to look at it because
You
I.
could potentially look at it over time and
Mhm.
look at how isotopes have changed for various things. That's really cool.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to circle back for a second, Alan, because I don't feel like I got a chance to properly introduce you.
Okay.
But
Yeah, I kind of
but
jumped right in there. That's fine. Yeah.
we mostly wanted to talk about a couple of papers that you wrote, fantastic papers, by the way, back in the early 2000s. And so, can we start from that point and have you kind of talk about what it was that drew you to work with turkeys and to study those questions specifically, and before we jump into the results of those papers?
Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. I guess I'll go back to college. I was a biology major, kind of broadly interested in things. My honors thesis was on in a beneficial insects lab, and I spent a couple summers working on uh, brown tree snake control in Guam. I don't know if you guys have heard of that system.
Hmm.
I know some folks that have
Yeah.
done work down
I,
there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I actually I
Uh,
teach about it in one of my ecology classes.
okay.
So
And birds. I'm always interested in birds. Actually, I can probably go back even farther, Marcus. My parents met in graduate school at University of Florida in the zoology
oh
department.
wow, there
Uh,
you go.
so way back. So I grew up. I didn't come from a hunting household. I'm not a hunter, but definitely an outdoorsy kid, fishing and things like that. And so I'm definitely interested in birds and wildlife, nature, and college. Um, Pursued that as a biology major. My first job after college was actually in Venezuela. This was before Chavez, so it was a little bit easier to work down there, I think.
Sure.
But no, and while I was down there, I fell in love with this species of cuckoo, um, a tropical cuckoo that had this really complicated social life where they, multiple males and females together in groups and sharing a nest and things like that. And so I got interested in birds or animals with really complex family life, social life, and trying to understand the cooperation and conflict that happens in those and how those kind of get worked out. And um, I didn't end up working on that, but my interest uh, got me to an advisor who also studied kind of similar birds. Walt Koenig was an adjunct professor at University of California, Berkeley. He studied a bird called the acorn woodpecker, which is also a very complicated bird with multiple breeding males and females at a nest and helping birds. And um, when I didn't return to the tropics, he gave me this paper from 1971, I think, on this turkey system, where you get these. The hypothesis was these males form these teams of brothers and compete against other males. And at this field station where Walt worked, these cooperative coalitions of gobblers were there, and he's kind of suggested, "Hey, why don't you look at these turkeys?" So I kind of, in some ways, I kind of fell into the turkey system from a question oriented orientation, where I was interested in, okay, we have this complex aggregation of males, and what's going on there? There's this hypothesis that hadn't actually been kind of supported with the kind of data that you'd want to support it with. And so I decided, well, I'm
Do
gonna
you
try this.
remember the
Yeah.
Do you remember the paper that what were the authors from 71?
Yeah. Watson Stokes was the paper, and it had
Mhm.
had
I
this.
was almost certain that's what you were
Yeah,
talking about.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Watson, yeah, and it was a really it had the illustration of the basically a lek system where you have, but with these teams of males kind of scattered through, and the single
Right.
males pushed to the periphery, and this really fascinating seasonal diagram of how these large winter flocks kind of split up in the you end up with the the hens kind of dispersing across the landscape, and then as creches kind of forming bigger and bigger flocks, and then everybody kind of comes back together in the fall and winter. And it's this really compelling story, and I kind of was surprised that nobody had you know gone back to work on this. I later found out there were a couple of attempts to do this, but yeah, I ended up kind of at the right place at the right time with the way the genetic technology was advancing, and
Mhm.
a population that was, I guess, I had some space to work in, and I would say, I don't know, there was hunting pressure there, lots of natural predators as well,
Mhm.
and but it was kind of the right place and the right time to do that. And I mean, I definitely wish I was doing it now when the GPS transmitters were a lot
Yeah.
cheaper. Yeah,
Well,
and
we're
the
glad you
genetic,
happened into it because it's
yeah,
still some of the best information that we have on the breeding
Yeah.
strategy of wild turkeys.
oh, thank you. Yeah, it was a I knew going in that no matter what I found would be interesting, because
Mhm.
Mhm.
there were a lot of hypotheses, a lot of possibilities, and we just you don't know till you actually do the genotypes and make the observations and see what's going on.
So, Alan, along those lines, can you kind of fill us in? Uh, what is this concept of kin selection? Could you explain that, I guess, to folks that that don't work in that area, what that means, and then what were you or how were you going about trying to test that?
Okay, sure. Yeah, so kin selection, uh, it's not really a alternative to natural selection. It's basically expanding how we think of natural selection as happening. I guess that's how I'd think about it. So, in kind of the basic natural selection, the way Darwin would have put it forward. If you have a behavior, if it's beneficial to you and you have more offspring because of that, then natural selection may tend to have that increase in the population if there's a genetic basis to that behavior. So when we think of kin selection, though, the idea is that we're not only thinking about the effect that behavior has on you, but it also what's the effect, either positive or negative, on closely related individuals. So we know, if you have a mother and a father, and they have multiple, if they have offspring, they're going to be sending some of those same genes into those different offspring. So brothers would have some of the same genetic variants shared because they have these close ancestors in common. So the way that would play out with the turkeys, you have a a male maybe helps a brother have more offspring, whether that's through as a kind of a increasing the courtship display, whether making it more attractive to hens, whether it's defending that little patch of temporary breeding grounds against other males. But that brother if that brother has more offspring because of that help, the brother that's helping, I don't, this is getting confusing to say, but the brother that's helping is actually indirectly benefiting because some of the brother's offspring are sharing his own genes. If that,
okay.
And so you showed, that was, in fact, at play in turkey populations. I think that was your 2005 paper in Nature, which for the listeners that aren't familiar with that publishing in Nature is kind of like the apex of our field. I mean, that is an world-renowned journal. And it showed in that paper, or you showed in that paper, that it would, a subordinate male that is not getting breeding opportunity is more likely to be genetically represented in the next generation through his brother than if he were to go off on his own and try to secure his own breeding opportunities instead of supporting his brother. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So having a brother, one of these wingmen is super helpful. And so that benefit is, even though you don't get full tally of the brother's offspring, partly because the brother, not all of, he would have gotten some of those offspring without help, maybe. And you also don't share 100% of your genes with your brother. You only share, on average, about 50% of your genes with your brother. But even with those kind of discounts, those helping those subordinate males, they did better than they would if they, on average, if they went off on their own and tried to be a solitary breeder. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
So it's like I can stay with my brother and pass on a small percentage of my genome through him, or I can go off on my own and pass on none of my genome to the next generation.
Yeah, basically, or very, very little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Alan, can you kind of walk us through? I'm really fascinated with this work and how you actually did it. So, what were you collecting in the field, from turkeys, or how were you getting samples, and what did it look like? I guess.
Yeah. So this was a multi-year study. It took me, 3 or 4 years of field work to just get enough samples. But I was trapping adult turkeys, males, gobblers, and hens.
And these were the Rio Grande subspecies, correct?
These are probably Rio Grande. That's one of the issues with California is it's harder to tell necessarily what's there. I think they're probably almost entirely Rio Grande, but there were some Miriam's introductions in that area in I want to say the 60s or 70s, and those didn't do very well. There might be a few lingering, one's genes from the Merriams there, and there could be some domestic barnyard. This is ranching country out there, so
Yeah.
there could be some of the I guess the domestic or eastern or whatever would be um, found in the barnyards there. But definitely Rio Grande, which is interesting. Maybe not coincidental that that's what the Watson Stokes paper also focused on, were those guys from Texas. I think these were maybe Oklahoma birds or Texas birds. I actually can't remember the exact
regional
lineage, but probably Rio Grande there.
Okay.
So catching birds usually kind of early breeding season, and then post nesting a little bit as well. And then I put radio transmitters on some hens and followed them. I started out trying to time hatches and catch, the 1 day old poults and get blood samples from them. But that was really hard to do. And I ended up doing something that probably not something that most managers would want as part of their study, but I ended up collecting early nests and incubating them for a little bit of time, and then just getting samples from destroying the eggs to get samples, and then those hens would re-nest, and I'd just let those go, and then if they happened to get depredated, I would try to get samples from eggshell remnants or something like that. So it's kind of a mix of samples from the offspring, and that the offspring are what were going to give me the success of these different strategies and roles of the males, the gobblers. So once I could assign parentage, so this is the Maury Povich show, like, you are the father, you are not the father. So we try to do that with as many of these offspring samples as we could. Some of those I had samples from the gobblers from, and other ones you can actually, if you know who the hen was, which usually I did, that's another thing we can get into, is the brood parasitism angle. But most of the time, the incubating hen is the mom, and I had her sample because I had caught her as well. Then you can try to reconstruct.
So were you? Yeah. So when you captured them, you were taking blood from them, or a feather or something, so that you could get the genetic information about the
I'd take
parents.
take a small blood sample from the inside the wing of the adults.
And then you also paired with all that genetic data, you had visible tags on the males, so that you could see, what size group they were in during the breeding season, right?
Right. Yeah. So I've actually, for both the hens and the toms, I used cattle ear tags. I'm not sure if this is still like a recommended practice or not, but at the time that was what was suggested to me, was to so the toms, I'd use kind of a brighter, bigger yellow one, and the hens, I'd have a gray one to be as inconspicuous as possible. And those were numbered, so I could tell from a distance who was who. And then I would try to find these birds as often as I could during the breeding season, to see who was around, were they courting, who were the teams of males. So I tried to make an easy to follow definition for this teamwork, where the toms had to be within about 6 feet of each other, displaying to a hen, and because you'll see, especially coming out of these winter flocks, you'll get a whole bunch of toms together. But once courtship really gets going, usually the toms won't tolerate other toms right nearby. So that's when you start to get them spacing out a little bit and looking a little bit more like that Lecking diagram that that was in that Watson Stokes paper. And
So
that's
so it's fascinating to me to think about doing that observational work and getting to sit around and watch all of this transpire. Can you tell us, like, maybe a particular day that was fascinating, or maybe if you can't think of a particular day? I know I wouldn't be able to, almost 20 years ago, 15 years ago now,
I
but
can't tell you an interesting day last week.
right.
yeah.
But what I'm envisioning here is like, what did the average day look like on the breeding grounds? Like how these groups were interacting, and did you see like a hen posture for breeding, and then, like what did that look like?
Well, something I was kind of surprised about is I actually almost never saw actual copulation. So these were
Okay.
mostly we'd show up, and also I'll say that, I mean, maybe this was just a feature of the population I was working in, but they weren't terribly reliable about coming to the same oak clearings day after day. So
Right.
it was often kind of chasing around birds. We had some radios we could follow, so we could try to find some. So we usually were catching the action kind of mid scene, and it was often, that was not ideal because often us showing up would kind of trigger the hens to start slowly moving into the forest.
That
And
checks
so,
out.
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
And this
They're
was
very unreliable.
Oh yeah, and this was a hunted population too, right? So
yeah.
So
There were
so
not
y'all weren't
directly on the reserve, but so I was working at, this was a research site. It's about 2,500 acres, but these turkeys had a home range that definitely wasn't limited to that that area. So we had permission to go on one of the neighboring ranches, and then I ended up picking up another ranch, part of another ranch, kind of down the valley. Even so, we were often just hoping to find any birds to watch. Ideally, from a vehicle or from far enough away where we wouldn't be disturbing them. But sometimes we would catch some really interesting things, and just even seeing the way these teams were working was pretty interesting. So, sometimes you have one of these teams courting some hens, and the subordinate male, all of a sudden he drops his tail. I'm like, what's going on? And then you see three jakes come along the edge of the field, and he's off after them like like a shot, and chasing them away while the dominant male keeps displaying. So that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it
Definitely,
is.
So predator attacks. So we had golden eagles were one of the major predators there, I think. So having a eagle, watching birds, and all of a sudden they all scatter, and then a golden eagle comes 40 feet over your head after your birds is pretty thrilling for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure.
So when you were talking about the example with the jakes, did you say the male that often secured the breeding opportunities would just continue to display while the helper males, the brothers, went and took care of the threat?
Mm-hmm. That's my impression of what would happen. That if there was any possibility of an imminent breeding opportunity, that dominant bird was going to be continuing to do that. And I think the hens, this is probably true for a lot of these birds, that one of the things that is really important is the males that show up and work hard. And if those toms can keep strutting, maybe that's that hour or that day that hen is going to be ready for breeding. And that's what's really important. So, and so, yeah, and the subordinate gobblers, they're if they're there to be bodyguards as well as wingmen, then that's pretty important too, to keep let that
Mhm.
dominant gobbler keep displaying and keep any other guys from getting too close, and basically have an unimpeded field for him to do his business. So yeah. Um,
So I know I'm asking you to go way back, but uh, I'm really fascinated with various aspects of this. So did you do you remember if you captured genetic information in the same nest from brothers?
uh,
So in other words, like would you know that a hen had potentially bred with multiple of the brothers in this brotherhood?
that I don't know how much we want to get into the weeds of these analyses, but I never found that. But um, definitely, my power to determine that it was not 100% at that time.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah, basically, you didn't have the
yeah,
genetic resolution to tease apart siblings.
yeah. So all the males that I had pretty high certainty of were the dominant
Yeah.
brothers, and
Hmm.
uh, so and that's the problem. That's one of the
Mhm.
tricky things with this, is that you do have the among your candidate dads are some that are pretty genetically similar, but
Yeah.
um, that gets a
I would.
bit into the
Yeah.
uh, the Condor paper. I had to make some assumptions about that, that
Mhm.
um, the males,
What
I would take the ones I was really certain of, and then any kids that were consistent with him, but maybe on a statistical level weren't as certain about.
Yeah.
I would also assign them to him, just because I knew he was a father. That it kind
Mhm.
of made him more likely to be a father. But
At
yeah, I
least
wouldn't
had some
say
of
that
his genetic information.
sorry, say that again.
Yeah, I was
Uh,
gonna say at least it was some of his genetic information,
mhm,
so it was one of his brothers, if
right,
not him.
exactly. Yeah,
Well, the reason I was
that's one of
asking,
those.
I
Yeah.
was thinking back to the Watts work, and I know we've talked about it a couple of times, and Will probably remembers better than I do, but there were a few times where a brother sort of snuck in and got a breeding opportunity while the one male, the dominant male was preoccupied with a female that was receptive.
Hmm.
One of the other brothers secured a different female that happened to come in
Yeah,
at a similar time.
I would absolutely believe that happens.
Yeah.
I didn't really see it happen. Actually, it's kind of interesting that one anecdote I have is that I did see, um, this was a real active time in the spring, and the dominant male gobbler was getting a solicitation, and then another female went up to the brother and seemed pretty interested, and the the subordinate brother seemed to be like he was starting to ramp up a little more, and the
Mhm.
dominant brother saw that and came over, and then the subordinate brother dropped his tail, and um, so in that case the
Coward down.
dominant guy was
He
able to
got his.
control things. But I mean, if you look at that welder diagram, I mean, that was a lot of birds
Yeah.
happening,
Yeah.
and yeah, you can imagine on these peak days there, it's definitely possible that um, the subordinate gobblers
Mhm.
have something going on. And another thing, well, maybe we'll jumping ahead to other questions here, but um, between years, I had pretty limited number of these teams that survived multiple years, and I always had the same guy as dominant in the subsequent years.
Hmm.
But I know there was an unpublished study from Michigan that had a lot of swapping. So in year one, male gobbler A was dominant, but the next year it would switch and gobbler B would be dominant. And that's certainly
Wow.
another way that these subordinates could be
Is it
benefiting, is if they're, okay, maybe it's your turn this year, or I lost the fight this year, and
So,
maybe
in that was that a master's or PhD thesis,
it was
or
yeah, it was by a professor named Anne Clark, and she. Um, I actually can't remember the reason why it never got published, but yeah, she was trying to follow up on the Watson Stokes story as well, and
yeah,
she had we once I was starting to present this stuff at meetings, she came up to me and we talked about it, and one of the possibilities we came up with is that in Michigan, like you as a gobbler, you have to not only contend with the really energetically costly breeding season. They're spending a lot of time strutting, not much time eating,
Mm-hmm.
and
mhm,
and then you go through the winter of Michigan,
mhm, yeah,
which is no picnic from what I understand. So it could be that that kind of double cost makes it
yeah,
hard to maintain that dominant status. But California, we have a much milder winter. Stuff greens up pretty early, and it could be that the dominant males can maintain that status a little bit more. So that's
yeah,
definitely one thing I want to emphasize is that these turkeys, they've got a really adaptable system, and what you find in one place may not be what you find in another place. And I fully expect and I hope that people will be kind of looking at these questions in different populations, because it's a
Mm-hmm.
really interesting
yeah,
opportunity. So many species are more locked into what they do, but I think turkeys are really interesting how they're going to respond to the climate, how they're going to respond to topography, how they're going to respond to uh, the patchiness and all the kind of environmental quality that you guys have been preaching about
mhm,
on the podcast. How far they have to go, how stressed they are, how much food they can give how much food the poults get, and the adults in the different times of year, and everything is
mhm,
it's all
Right.
really important.
Yeah, circling back to that for a second with the anecdotes about subordinate males, kind of slipping in and getting a breeding opportunity every now and then. One of the reasons that that fascinates me is because it's still kind of up in the air as to whether the subordinate, and it was clear from your study, just to because I think we haven't directly stated this, but it was clear from your study that there were a handful of males that dominated the vast majority of the breeding opportunity.
Mhm.
Okay, so with those other males, the ones that are not dominating it, the question has been, and what I referenced as being up in the air a moment ago, is are they physically incapable of breeding, aka infertile, or are they just being behaviorally excluded from breeding?
Uh,
And it sounds like from your anecdote, it's more of the exclusion, the latter.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think. I mean, I've definitely seen. You know, I guess one way to answer that is that the ultimate fate of these teams is that predation or hunting brings them down to one, and that one
Mm-hmm.
guy, no matter if he was the dominant or if he's subordinate, is going to be displaying at some point.
Mm-hmm.
mhm,
Right.
Um, and so some of it's behavioral, whether it's within the team, whether it's in the broader dominance hierarchy of the population. Another thing is it's kind of maybe a little more under the control of the hens and where they go. At
Mm-hmm.
least in my population, it was a pretty topographically complex area. So we had uh, valleys and areas that were somewhat isolated from other valleys. Like you can imagine the the main hen flock kind of splits up, and some go up this drainage, and some go up this drainage, and some go another drainage, and so there's no way that these dominant teams are going to be able to control all of that. It just gets too spread out and too isolated, and so you can have kind of a mismatch of kind of numbers and dominance with what's actually going on with the hens, where you have
Mm-hmm.
maybe one of these subgroups has, maybe two teams and a solitary male all following this group of three but hens, but then one valley over you might have four hens, and oh wow, you get this lucky dude or team that's there by themselves. And it's pretty interesting how that lottery plays out, and how much of that is under control of the hens and how much is just luck, and how much it matters. I know you guys have been talking about the sperm storage, and maybe they've already made their choice, so maybe it doesn't matter so much then. But we know that these hens are mating multiply, so it does maybe make some difference. If she wants to refresh, or sees another guy she likes somewhere or something, then that'll these kinds of dynamics are pretty interesting, and something I wish I had a better handle on. It's just I was able to get kind of the broader patterns, but a longer term study with everybody marked and GPS on everybody and everything would be ideal.
Be remarkable.
Yeah.
Well, Alan, I mean, the work. I'm not aware of anything else like that with the kin selection, but I think you pretty convincingly show, at least in the population you were studying, that there's kin selection where some of the male brothers, the helpers, so to speak, aren't doing hardly any, if any, of the breeding. But the math works out, because you did the math, where they might still, get more of their genetics to the next generation, so to speak, by cooperating like that. And then I asked you about the multiple brothers being represented in a nest, and that was mainly because now is where I'm kind of confused.
Okay.
So in your other paper, you also show, which is the only data potentially on this that I'm aware of, where almost half of the nest had multiple fathers represented in it.
Right.
Yeah, that statistic blew my mind.
Yeah, I don't understand, like, if there's only a few males dominating the breeding opportunity, how does every nest still have multiple, not everyone, every other nest still has multiple fathers represented? That to me is remarkable.
So I think it just indicates that gobblers have some control, but not complete control over what's going on, that the hens are making multiple choices. I guess if that wasn't clear, they aren't, those multiple dads aren't the two brothers. It's the dominant male and then somebody else, whether it's somebody in another team, whether
so it's like a dominant male somewhere else.
Like maybe she goes over to that other valley.
Yeah. Is she just like bouncing around between each of the dominant male groups? And
I wish I knew. But
she's
probably
just like hitting up each bar on the
way. I don't know exactly. I mean, as I said, I didn't see the copulation events really. So the way this actually plays out behaviorally, I don't know.
Yeah, but you did demonstrate convincingly on the other end. The nest was, they made it happen somehow.
Yeah.
Like there's definitely, 50% or 48% of the nests had multiple, right? Or wait, no, 45%.
Yeah, 45% had multiple paternity, aka multiple fatherhood. And I've got a note here that says one nest even had three fathers.
Yeah, I think if I remember right, that was the incubating hen had mated twice, and then a parasitic hen had a different mate. So that would be the three. I think that's how that worked. Maybe if these had larger clutches, you would eventually find more than two hens. I don't know that more than two matings. But at some point we know there are birds where almost every egg in a nest is from a different dad. So we know that can't
Mhm.
happen, and that's not happening with turkeys. So
Mhm.
most of about half are just a single gobbler, and then it's not every egg a different dad. It's some relatively small number greater than one for these other
Yeah.
paternity cases. Yeah.
Well, what was fascinating to me too that I'd never noticed before, because I've read through both of these papers that we're focusing on today several times over the past several years, and one thing that had never stood out to me until I reviewed it just this morning before speaking to you is that there were actually three. So you had you followed seven dominant members of male coalitions, and three of those didn't even father any offspring.
Yeah, I think that's mostly a sampling issue. That if
Okay.
because I didn't
You'd
have
got more
all the
than
hens
hens.
sampled. Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
so I think the numbers are a good start. If you had all the hens sampled and were able to like take out every nest, which
Yeah.
Sure.
I probably,
It's
if I
not
did
even I
that
mean, it's
from
not
year
really
one, I might not
practical.
have had many turkeys left for year two. But
Well, it's not really practical in almost any scenario to
mhm,
have everybody marked. I mean,
yeah,
it's hard enough just to get a reasonable sample, much less everybody.
hmm
But
amen.
yeah, it was. It's also pretty remarkable that quite a few of the nests have multiple mothers represented too.
hmm
Mhm.
Yeah, that's
So,
yeah, that was something I was expecting to see. I'm not sure I expected that high a number. But it's actually not too uncommon with birds like ducks and game birds that uh, it's not so costly for an incubating hen to take on an extra egg
mhm,
or two. So there aren't so many defenses against that in the same way that you know a bird with a pair bond and both parents feeding and those
mhm,
they're having to take actually feed those kids throughout childhood. That's a much bigger hit, and that's you get a
mhm.
lot of different strategies. But yeah, actually, that's another. If I did a review of that, I don't know if you caught that paper, but that's actually
I
pretty common um, for game birds to do this, and even accidentally do it in other game bird species. So one of
oh,
the
not even the correct species.
yeah, so actually I got onto this because I was monitoring a turkey nest and I came upon it and there's a California quail sitting on the the nest and
Oh, I bet that looked
it had
hilarious.
just laid an egg, which is like
It's like half the
huge size
size of.
mismatch. Yeah, I mean better I guess that than the opposite with the turkey laying in a
It's
quail nest. But yeah, it was
I'm just imagining it sitting on an egg that's half its size,
yeah
and it's just like, hey, this was a really
yeah.
good one, good egg.
But it's pretty yeah
I-
it's pretty it's not too uncommon, and the I mean the thing that I found amazing is that these nests are so hard to find, and so there's a lot of
Yeah,
interesting behavior that we really don't know much about is how these hens are maybe interacting,
yeah,
how they're following each other. It's pretty one of the things I did find with the if you put all this together with the parentage is that a lot of these parasitic hens had mated with the same tom that the
yeah.
incubating hen had.
Yeah, I
yeah,
saw that.
That kind of
yeah. It was
speaks
about
to
half of them, I thought, right?
yeah that what could be going on is this tom is with this subgroup of hens and
Right.
mates with all of them, and then the hens are following each other to the nest, and so
Right.
it makes sense that the same tom would be the father of both if they're kind of
Mhm.
constrained a little bit more in time and space as they get closer to nesting.
Yeah, and that
But yeah,
also
Yeah,
explains why hens try to be so secretive when they're going off to nest because they're trying to prevent that from happening.
yeah, Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely could be. I mean,
Well, there's a couple of things. One is an anecdote that was paraphrased by one of our recent guests, Mike Chamberlain. He was paraphrasing another one of the last generation of researchers, we'll just say, with Healy, and he had imprinted a bunch of turkeys and had captive a facility, and he was talking about the nesting, and even Healy viewed the hens as being very secretive and, had a lot of unrest about him being nearby if they were going to go to the nest. So
oh, really?
they do seem to be secretive. But you said something else right then that made me kind of question the assumption. I was sort of assuming that hens maybe in the same group, were more likely to parasitize each other. So it sounded like maybe you thought that might be the case since they had the same father
Hmm.
often, but half of them also didn't have the
Right.
same father. So that would suggest that it may not always be even hens tracking each other within their own hen group.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, we don't. I wish I knew. Yeah, I mean, it'd be great to know the history. I mean, all I can say is that at least in one of the cases, the parasitic hen did have her own nest, and so
Hmm.
it may or may not be that some of these are only parasitic hens. Maybe they're maybe a Jenny that's just getting going and um,
Yeah,
not not really sure about
that
nesting yet or something, or
Yeah,
that
she
is
had the
we just
energy
don't
to
know.
lay, but she didn't have the energy to incubate or something.
Mhm.
well, it is really curious because it's pretty common that what I mean, even 20% of the hens would not initiate a nest. I
Is
mean,
that
based on GPS data, even,
okay?
we would just not see any indication that she tried to nest.
Hmm.
Maybe those hens are just going and laying an egg in everybody else's
Yeah,
nest.
That's a
I
good
never,
point. I've never thought of that.
yeah,
I
yeah.
never
That would be
thought
really
about her
interesting.
just being, yeah, she's just like completely committed to parasitism instead of making her own nest.
I mean, it's possible. I mean, that's you think about some of the waterfowl, and you do get specialization where some of the the females are mainly there to parasitize, and um,
Those
but yeah, we
sneaky,
just don't know. And
sneaky.
I guess you probably need higher resolution GPS. I mean, I guess that a lot of these studies are just taking a few points a day, and then
Mm.
these visits to the
There's
nest are so quick.
Yeah, we well, I shouldn't say just from us. It's pretty common, from what I understand, across many researchers with their projects that will have a location per hour, and during the laying stage in particular, we are getting locations every half hour. So I think you'd probably pick that up.
Okay, at least get close enough to have an idea.
Yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, that's really interesting stuff. I mean, your data clearly shows that there's a there's a lot of eggs in the basket, so to speak.
Mhm.
That's what he he wanted us to say last week. There not only are multiple males represented in a nest, but multiple females often are also represented in a nest. And to me, that's pretty wild. I just didn't expect it, especially with the multiple females. Uh, I kind of expected, I guess, the multiple male thing, but not the multiple female thing. I don't know why.
Yeah, I thought I'd find like maybe one or two, and that would be
Mhm.
like, oh, it happens. But yeah, I wasn't expecting that big a contribution. I mean,
Yeah.
they're not splitting a nest evenly, so
Mhm.
it's only usually just one or two eggs in a parasitic eggs because at
Yeah.
some point it probably gets too big to possibly incubate for the.
Yeah.
I mean, that might be part of it, or they just if they're off to other nests or something, then they gotta, or their own
So,
nest, or we don't know the answers to these questions.
right.
Yeah.
So, we, just recorded and released last week an episode with Dwayne Elmore. And Alan, you said you got a chance to listen to that
Yeah,
episode.
that was so fascinating. Yeah, I was really
Okay,
glad I caught
cool,
that. Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
But the focus of that conversation was kind of on, if you would expect that, turkeys being somewhere on this lucking spectrum, I think is
Mhm.
how Dr. Elmore referred to it, um, that they would, regardless of where they are on that spectrum, that process involves being very conspicuous and potentially vulnerable to predation, whether that be from humans or from animal predators. And so it makes sense for them to have, multiple mechanisms that they can compensate for the loss of particular males that may be important in breeding in that given area. And so it seems like, these data that you got with half of these nests having multiple paternity might be one of those mechanisms. Would you agree with that?
I think so. Yeah, that's uh, that one guy in the population may do very well, may father a lot of offspring, but he's not some linchpin for the whole mating system in a way that maybe in a few of these lecking species they might be.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Like true lecking species, I guess that's a whole other
Right.
conversation there. But yeah, the the gobblers advertise their position every morning. Hens advertise their position often with yelping and things like that, and so
Mm-hmm.
across the landscape, you have ways that these birds are going to get together, even if they end up not being entirely predictable in time and space where it's going to be, but they can find each other when they need to,
Mm-hmm.
and they can. There's enough males out there that are um, I don't think there's going to be a problem with hens finding breeding opportunities. I guess unless you get to really low densities or really
Right.
Mhm.
spread out in some way.
Certainly.
Um,
Yeah, and
Hmm.
I mean another thing that I've oftentimes wondered about, and this goes into the point that you made earlier about more folks need to do this type of work in a wider variety of environments is, and it sounds like your site had a good bit of at least topographical variation. But I also have wondered, like from the time that I read Watt's original work, how does that relationship with a small number of males dominating breeding hold up in areas that are, more heavily forested? For example, like can the males, monopolize mating opportunities as effectively there as they can in a place like South Texas where Watts did his work?
that's a great question. I don't know the answer. I would suspect that they are not able to. That when you have the forested populations, from what I understand, that there is a little bit more dispersion of the birds. I don't,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
um, and certainly, uh, yeah. Well, I would guess that it's going to be a little more evenly spread out in terms of reproduction.
Sure.
What that means
Mhm.
for harvest, I would, with my birds, in California, and there were birds that were kind of glued to the hen groups, but then there were other birds that were just kind of searching the landscape, and you'd find them. They tended to be gobbling more, just and they seem to be more of a searching strategy than
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
a uh, I'm losing the word here, but they
Yeah, like
just
more of
following
a
the
lecking.
hens around. um,
More of like
but,
a rambler.
exactly,
You know,
yeah,
the
yeah.
more it's like the more GPS studies that we pile up, the more we realize that there do seem to be some very, you know, v- some high degree of variation in breeding strategies among individual males of a species.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the more you the more you watch a species, the more you're going to find this interesting variation. And that's, even with, these terms, these mating system terms that we use are kind of hiding just a whole lot of variation in, what individual males are doing or what's going on place to place. So,
yeah.
so
Yeah, as humans, we like to put things in these neat categories when oftentimes everything's a shade of gray.
Right. And turkeys are kind of the worst for that because I don't know that they fall into anything perfectly neatly. I mean, it's definitely hearing Dr. Elmore's discussion this morning that, there are a lot of lek-like properties of some of these higher density turkey populations where you might have a field and you've got multiple males courting, and even these multiple teams courting hens there, but these are moving around a lot. There's maybe you get kind of bleed into pheasant territory where you have harem defense, if these males are able to really kind of guard these groups over the landscape, and if they're not really predictable. And then you have other birds that are moving around trying to find what's going, finding unattended females or groups that are maybe vulnerable to being taken over, things like that. So it's but yeah, I think thinking about leks, it's really one of the properties there is you have the kind of instantaneous competition among males and maybe the choice by hens within that group. So to that extent, turkeys in a lot of places are going to share that property. And when you're thinking about harvest, maybe that means there's backups there. You're not going to maybe kind of making it a less efficient system in any real important, impactful way if you are taking birds.
Within
that
reason.
Would make sense. Yeah, within reason. But compared that to sage grouse leks, where the leks are very traditional. They can be sinks for males if there's really they'll keep continuing to come to these places when there's no hens day after day. It's really pretty can be really depressing to watch that happen actually. And disruption of those leks is probably much more impactful to population processes that I would think than for turkeys. So thinking about how leks work in terms of harvest, it's you really have to think about the local population, and it's hard to take lessons necessarily from other species.
So, Alan, I was just curious. Do you remember how many different fathers, so to speak, you identified in the genetics work?
Yeah, I don't. I think I want to say it was around 10 males over the course of 3 years. And again, that was very undersampling, with a lot of undersampling of the hens. So there were more than that going on.
Sure. Well, yeah, because you were, some of them you were throwing out even if they were siblings or potentially. But I was just trying to figure out, because you had I forgot in this paper how many nests you had represented, but so that's like on average, if it was 10, it was a male per 3 or 4 nests.
Yeah,
right. Like each male would have that on average. But was there a male that stuck out as being super dominant male?
There were a couple top toms in the population for sure, and that I was looking at. Where
one of them you said was the short beard.
Yeah, he was one of them. And then I remember there was one that I think was one I wasn't able to catch. I didn't have him marked, but his his duo was high up there for sure. So so those are the males that are always with hens, and clearly were highest in the male dominance hierarchy
Yeah.
of the population. So
So you said the bulk of your work was on a 2,500 acre preserve?
well, that's where I was based out of, but
Okay.
I'm not sure I know the total acreage that I ended up working on, because
Yeah,
there
because
was
you
a
were all over the
neighboring ranch.
neighboring.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then maybe I want to say 8 miles or 10 miles down the road, there was
Okay.
another site that um, we were allowed research access to
Mhm.
part of that ranch. But the birds were just moving in and out of visibility and even
Mhm.
radio range. I think. I mean, it was so I had a hard time. There were definitely a lot of hens that went and nested off site that I couldn't follow.
Right.
Mhm.
I guess I asked that because I was just interested to see if you had 10 primary breeders in your study, like what kind of acreage that was across.
Oh yeah, I mean that was also that's compiling across
Multiple
Mhm.
multiple
populations,
years. So
really. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
in any given year there was fewer, um, for maybe a few dozen hens, there would be I would detect maybe 4 or 5 toms, something like that.
Yeah.
And then I'm trying to remember how many. Actually, that's not including the unsampled males that I knew were breeding that I didn't actually know who they were, but I knew there was an unknown dad out there that had a certain genetic profile. So
Mhm.
I don't know the exact number. This was the habitat was open oak woodland, kind of rolling hills, and then kind of steeper ravines,
Mhm.
Mhm.
and then some of the you know those ravines tended to be forested, especially on the north facing slopes with some pretty dense cover. But it was pretty continuous, and all ranches in the or kind of state forest
Mhm.
area. So it was, I guess, for turkeys, it was pretty good, and they could move around quite a bit.
Right.
They weren't constrained to. Well, I guess certain times of year it got hot, and they would probably need to be close to water, but otherwise they had kind of um, they had a lot of space to travel. It wasn't kind of like hardcore agriculture and then urban, or it wasn't as much of a matrix that probably a lot of places have.
So so Alan, we really appreciate your time today. Is there anything that you expected us to ask about or something that you were just eager to share that we haven't gotten to?
Not that I can think of. I mean, I know I feel like you just talked about this, although I guess it was last week with the Lecking stuff.
Mhm.
When we kind of covered that a little bit, and definitely, you know, I'm just happy to share my experience with the turkey mating system, and I'm, hope this does spur some people to share anecdotes or even get some, more detailed studies going, and follow up on some of this. Yeah,
I like and appreciate the spur pun you slipped in there.
well, what did I say? I don't even remember that.
You said
But,
spur some other folks to
oh
keep
right, yeah,
studying this,
okay,
and
there
Yeah,
you go.
there you
I was like, man, we only come up with the egg puns. We got to up our game now. But
Uh,
Well,
so
but
I want to
I
Alan,
intentional.
would
I
say
forgot I just said that, but yeah, okay.
I can
Um,
one
say that I really appreciated this conversation. Marcus and I and many others have been talking about your work, intensively for the past several years because it is some of the best work that we have done on this, and hopefully,
Mhm.
that serves as kind of a foundation for us to build out from.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I just really appreciate the birds, and how they're just fascinating to me, how adaptable they are. A lot the way a lot of these game species are, they can seem just tough and amazing, but also kind of fragile at the same time. And these are just really cool piece of wildlife that we have in the U.S. and even in places like California, where there's probably a lot of people that see them in less kind light, given the way they are kind of invading urban spaces. But there's a lot there in terms of their show and their social behavior. There's a lot to admire about them, I think. So I guess that's the last thing I'd want to share. That I'm not a hunter. I definitely appreciate the hunting tradition that's led to them being conserved and everything, and that there's even if you're not a hunter, you can still find a lot to love about these birds. So
absolutely,
that's what I'd want to say.
They are really, really, really interesting, and also, as everybody we talk to says, it's just like a hodgepodge of traits that don't. Sometimes they don't make sense when you compare them to other species around the world, at least. But really, really interesting, and we appreciate you taking time to come talk about it.
Yeah,
I love hearing these different perspectives like this. Like, I would have never thought to do some of the things that you did, but now I see how valuable that was, and it's really showing, particularly the, having multiple fathers and mothers represented in each nest, or many of the nests. That's just showing you another mechanism, that makes this bird resilient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so. All right. Well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks everybody out there for listening. We really appreciate all the feedback and everything. And we do have another thing to give away.
Uh-oh.
Will, are you going to make me do all of these?
Yes. I'll just go ahead and be straightforward about it.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a shirt this time that we're going to give away. It's a camouflage shirt. Another one from Florida Camo brand.
Okay.
So they've got really cool gear, and he's given us some, several things to give away to our audience because he supports the show, and I really appreciate that. So again, pretty random process. So this listener was also a 5-star, and
pretty random.
Do what?
You said it was a pretty random process. I still am doubting the randomization of
it
your
is
process.
Random. It is relatively random. So I did enjoy this name because it gave me nice memories about an experience with a really nice shotgun that I got to use one time. It's Benelli Boy 05. He said this is a must listen. Goes without saying that this show is a must for quality turkey management. So we really appreciate that review. And Benelli Boy 05, if you're listening, just reach out to us and we'll get you connected so that you can get your shirt. They are going to come straight from the manufacturer with that one since we need a size specific. So Benelli Boy 05.
And hopefully it'll look good with this Benelli shotgun.
I hope so.
I hope he actually shoots Benelli.
Yeah, maybe he has a Florida camo on the shotgun.
He could.
All right. Thanks everybody for listening.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.